explain, as we will discuss, I first explain, then you discuss, the definition of rabbinical authority in Israel is one of the most difficult and unsolved problems that we face, with the possible exception of Palestinian and other issues. And on the internal issues, a lot of Israeli politics and friction can be understood through these issues. No, I'm starting slowly and working my way up. It's okay. The rest of you may have that we had on the question of, it was not my favorite topic, but it was on the diaspora-Israel relations. And somebody said that the diaspora played a very central role in terms of, you can say it better than I can, forcing Israel to not make policies on conversion issues that are destructive and exclude not just the diaspora, but a large part of the Jewish population. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. That internally we are in a state of gridlock. To understand Israel, to understand Israeli politics, to understand the question of conversion, and many, many other questions, status, the question of the monopoly, maybe that's actually what somebody else talked about, the monopoly of the Orthodox, not just the Orthodox, but it's become more of a Haredi, ultra-Orthodox, religious sector of Israel over the main religious activities in the country. And isn't that something that violates democratic principles? All sorts of things are involved in this issue. So I want to take a step back. I don't know what backgrounds you come from, so I'm going to ask a few questions to get a sense. And I'm going to first talk about Israeli politics, the structure of Israeli politics, and then I'm going to talk about, it will lead me directly to the issue of the role of the clergy, the religious hierarchy within Israeli politics, and from there to the specific issue of conversion and why that is such a hot-button item. It is in newspaper headlines more than peace talks, more than Iran. The last few months it's been the dominant headline in the Israeli press, except for the week of the fire. So, and even there was a direct relationship, which maybe I'll explain how that all gets put together in terms of the Minister of Interior, who's a rabbi and head of the Shas party. Let me just ask you, does anybody know how many different parties are represented in the Israeli Knesset now? Anybody want to take a guess? I don't know for sure because it changes periodically. I hear 13, 14, 50, they're all right. Somewhere in that number because parties some parties of 4 people split off to become 2 parties of 2. It moves around.
You can always be sure to say between 1 and 120.
Yes. 2 Jews, 3 opinions. But the fact that we have on the order of 12, 13, 14, maybe more parties in the Knesset tells you a lot about Israeli politics. It tells you about how fractionated it is. The coalition has 5 or 6 parties in it. And that's not unusual. And to hold that coalition together, whatever the dominant party is, whether it's a party that's led by Likud or a party that's led by Kadima, as it was for a few years, or by Labour Party, whoever is the lead party in the coalition, in the last 10, 15, 20 years, never gets more than about 20% of the votes, 20 to 25% of the votes. They need coalition partners. That's the largest party. And so in order to get to, out of a Knesset of 120 members, to get to a majority in order to govern, even to get the mandate of becoming the head of the government, you need to put together a coalition of 61 seats. If you only have 27, 28, 29, then you have to add more than double the seats that you have. In a certain sense, you are a minority. If you, Likud, Benjamin Netanyahu has less than half the seats in his coalition and less than a quarter of the seats in the Knesset. Which means that you have to survive, you have to put together a coalition. Now, why is this so? Why are there so many different political parties in Israel? There are a number of reasons. My general rule in politics, in most of life, but particularly in politics, is anything that's complicated and interesting usually has a number of explanations that feed onto each other, that add, that strengthen each other. So there's not one single factor. So I will lay out a few of these factors to explain why it is that we have so many parties, and then within that, why it is that what are called the religious parties, and I have a little bit of a problem with that. I'll try not to get too much into the details of teaching Israeli political science, but what are called religious parties, and there's so many differences that it's a problem. But the parties that are headed by rabbis, that are largely charismatic or sectoral or ethno-religious parties, why they end up almost in every election holding the balance of power. I mean, you can all go home now because that's the bottom line. They hold so much power because they can topple a government. And therefore, on their issues, they can set the agenda. And as I will try to remember to say later, it's always good to get your main points out early, and then people, if they fall asleep or if I forget to run out of time, the question of how much political courage, how much of a cost, how much political capital a prime minister is willing to use in order to change the system, in order to get out of this catch-22 system, which may cost him his own position, is something that in politics rarely happens. Why do we have so many parties? The first explanation is that the Zionist movement began in Eastern Europe in the late 19th century. Eastern Europe in the late 19th century, we have a Polish political system, not of the late 19th century, not recommended, which means that it is very fractionated, that every group is represented. Now, for the Zionist movement, that made a lot of sense, because there was no territory, there was no geographical location. So that when my grandfather in Galicia or later on in Berlin left angered his rabbanim and was willing to have a pushka for the Zionist movement in his house, and millions of other Jews began to flock to be magnetized by Theodor Herzl and the Zionist movement in that time. They were in all of these different countries, and in conditions of war and difficult, very difficult conditions, including pogroms at the beginning of the 20th century and all the way through that period, when there was no territorial base. Most of the members of the Zionist movement that were not living in Eretz Yisrael in that time period. And it was an inclusive framework. The idea of the Zionist movement, particularly at the beginning before the great split between the revisionists and the non-revisionists, I guess, were to be as inclusive as possible, and to bring those who supported Zionist movements from different aspects of the Zionist ideological perspective as it developed into the movement. And therefore it meant giving every organization, every framework, every country, every leadership a piece of the action. And that's how the Zionist movement developed. And of course, in Jewish politics, the Zionist politics, there was a lot, even before the establishment of the state, there was a lot of coalition building and coalition destroying and maneuvering among these different factions to get support for controlling the Zionist executive and eventually for controlling the beginning of the state. Now, the religious parties were part of that. Religious Zionism goes back almost to the beginning. Different forms of religious Zionism, certainly among most of the ultra-Orthodox. I'll use that once or twice, and then I'll go back to Haredi, because all of these terms are somewhat problematic. But the Haredi world, the Haredi leadership was not, most of them were not willing to join the Zionist movement. In fact, they condemned the Zionist movements for being secularists, for joining this non-religious movement when God was ready to reestablish the Jewish people in the land of Israel. Then God will do it. And politics, secular politics, led by secular leaders for sure, that was something that was completely unacceptable. But for the Zionist, religious Zionists, and there were increasing numbers of them in Europe, not just Europe, but primarily in Europe before the Shoah, before World War II, that to bring them into the camp with their own views of what the nature of the Jewish state should be, including the view that the Jewish state is a halachic state, that to state it as it was stated, to be governed by Jewish religious law. There were discussions of recreating a Sanhedrin. And that meant also providing a political role, political dominance, according to many of the people in religious Zionism, for the rabbinate. And this was all part of the development of the Zionist and then became the Israeli political process. There was no time, and there was really no interest in changing the political system as Israel moved, the Jewish people, as the Zionist movement moved from a proto-national nation state in the 1940s through the declaration and establishment of the state in 1948. There was no time with the bombardment, with the war beginning and everything else. There was no discussion about changing the system. You took the Zionist movement as it existed on May 15th, 1948, and that became the basis for the Israeli state. And on that basis, all of the leaders of these various movements that were involved prior to the establishment of the state then converted themselves, without even a blink of an eye, to being political parties in running for Knesset and establishing coalitions in the state that began to function in that process. One of the major problems that Israel has, and I'll talk about many of the internal political problems, is the fact that there was never a good time to change the system. There are always reasons. Actually, I think the best time was right after the previous election 2 years ago, when Netanyahu and Tzipi Livni could have formed a coalition precisely to change the political process. And I'll talk about that also as I get towards the end, as a means of getting out of this conundrum, because it has to be changed through political process. The establishment of the state, in many ways, what academics say, reified, it solidified what was a dysfunctional political process. Everything that was there before, where it really didn't make all that much difference because it didn't have responsibilities. The Zionist movement, yes, it ran, the Jewish Agency for Israel ran services for the Jewish sector in the mandated Palestine up until 1948 when the British left, but their real responsibilities were quite minimal. It was largely the mandate that established the power for raising taxes and providing education. Yes, Kupat Cholim and the different medical services, all of which were based on party lines and party affiliations, and the different newspapers also based on party lines and party affiliations, were all part of that process, but their role relative to what they do in a state system was quite limited. And then, May 15th, 1948, Hey Be'iyar, and now the Jews have this state that we have to actually have functioning. Again, if you understand the conditions that were there at the beginning of the formation of the state, Ben-Gurion, I think there was no other choice, but he certainly should get credit for doing it anyway, no other rational choice. Maintain the status quo. Try to make the political system as inclusive as possible. And that meant bringing in the national religious party, the Mizrahi was brought in as part of the initial coalition, with terms that were acceptable, negotiated, but which were acceptable. They were negotiated, but I don't think we can call the negotiations extremely difficult in that time. There were no crises because there was no time, there was no energy for crises, and it wasn't such a big deal. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. I'll also give credit to my colleague, Professor Eliezer Donyeche, who wrote his doctoral dissertation on this many years ago and has been publishing the evolution of the process of the relationship between the religious Zionists within Israeli politics. What was the deal? No buses out on Shabbat were also state-controlled. Everything was state-controlled in those days. The state wasn't going to violate Shabbat in Yerushalayim. It was located in Haifa, in Tel Aviv, and other places. There were compromises all over the place. And these are all perceived as temporary. Yeshiva bachers, mainly from the Haredi world. We're talking about a few hundred young men and women, particularly women especially, going to join in the fighting. By the way, many of what we now call Haredim were active in the military in Jerusalem in particular in 1948. On their own, it had the lines had not been established as completely firm and immobile between who went into the army and who was allegedly studying in the yeshiva. I have to be careful what I say because this is being recorded and broadcast. I don't want to be too cynical on how I say this. And Ben-Gurion accepted the demand in order to bring in the Haredi party or parties into the broader frame of Zionism. This was not a time to have intense conflicts over what the state was. The language of the language of the Declaration of Independence was carefully negotiated to include enough religious symbolism and language, but not to commit. And there was no constitution, and there's still no constitution. In terms of establishing all sorts of what in the United States are called basic rights, and under the American Constitution, in the UK, I have to be careful here. You can tell by my accent, my knowledge of UK politics is somewhat limited. But in terms of the British unwritten constitution that developed in Israel, because of the fear of creating or the inability to agree on a lot of issues of principle, in terms of authority and power, there's no constitution. There was compromise after compromise to prevent an explosion, to prevent anybody from walking out. So there were two court systems that were developed. There is the secular court, which deals with all sorts of secular issues. But there is also a religious court system, Batei Din. And the difference between Israel and diaspora, 2,000 years of Galut, is that in Israel, these are not voluntary institutions. If you're a British Jew and you have an issue that you want to adjudicate, you can decide to go to the Beit Din, or you can decide that you want to be outside the community and take the whatever costs that are involved and adjudicate outside the Beit Din. And in every other diaspora community, it's like that. In Israel, you don't have that option. The power of law is vested in, under issues of personal status, marriage, divorce, conversion, the issue we're here to talk about. All of those issues are in the province of the religious court system, the Batei Din. And that was agreed upon with the establishment of the state, largely in terms of continuity. During the Mandate period, each religious community, dating back even to the Ottoman Millet system, each religious community had autonomy for dealing with matters of personal status. So you would have a religious court system for different Christian sects, Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox, for Muslims, and for Jews. For Jews, not for Orthodox and what do you say here, progressive and liberal Jews, Jews. And the power structure is vested in the rabbinate being, of course, strictly Orthodox. There was no concept of anything different as this process was evolving back over 100 years ago. And as I said, this was taken lock, stock, and barrel into the new state. We know it's clear that Ben-Gurion and most of the other Labor Party, it's a little bit of an abbreviation, the coalition from the Israeli Socialist Labor Left that ran the country under Ben-Gurion, and then afterwards Eshkol and Golda and Rabin, all of that whole structure saw this as a temporary compromise. Ben-Gurion really saw this as this is after the Shoah, after the Holocaust. There are a few hundred survivors of yeshiva bochers wanting to reestablish the yeshivot that were destroyed in Europe, Poland and Vilna and elsewhere. What harm is it to give them the right to be able to reestablish those yeshivot and give them an exemption from army duty and the friction with the secular world? This is all about the friction with the secular world in terms of philosophy and theology. They need to be protected within this religious framework. But it was clearly seen as temporary. They're not going to last very long in a modern world. A few years at most. Well, here we are, 62 years later, and the numbers are huge. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of not every year, but a total population of men, 18-year-old and above, who do not serve in the army and are defined as being yeshiva students. So the situation perpetuated itself. The representatives, the leaders of these communities were all and are all rabbis. And the point that I want to make is that the Israeli political structure, in some ways I would say unknowingly, not as a deliberate, carefully thought out plan, but as a continuation of what the process and maintains stability from that process in the period of establishing the state, empowered, and the rabbis sought, demanded, and acquired political power. And they are not, like any other political structure, are unwilling to give up that power. Nobody gives up. I don't know any instance where some organization or framework or individual gives up political power voluntarily. They can certainly justify it on religious and social and other grounds that they have the right to having this power, but the simple fact is that they have the power. And so you have 4, 5, 6 different parties, depending on the coalition and the structure and the divisions within the divisions of the different parties. I never know whether I'm supposed to refer to somebody as being an Agud Yisrael or Degel HaTorah. I don't know which stream, whether they come from the Lita'im or from the Galitz. They're different streams, and each one has 1 or 2 representatives, and sometimes they fight with each other and bring somebody else in. But there are a number of different structures with sectors within Israel that are represented by rabbis and have a major role. Now, apart from the fact that you had a protected Haredi community, an Ashkenazi Haredi community, that grew and prospered in the framework during the period of the establishment of the state over the last 60 years, the second element that reinforced it, and this was something I don't think that Ben Gurion or anybody really anticipated. As soon as the state was established, you had approximately 1 million Jews from Eastern countries, from North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, from Iraq, from other countries, from Egypt, from Syria, coming into Israel. And they lived in terrible conditions. They were caught between the modern secularism that most of Israel had evolved into and was advertising and marketing, and at the same time, a very strong affinity to a culture that was left behind of traditional observance. The leaders of this community, and we're talking about a very significant portion of the Israeli population, let's say roughly, let's exclude for a minute the Russian immigrants, which are also 1 million people, which changed things a lot in the last 15, 20 years. But throughout the 60s and 70s, we had roughly an equal distribution of largely secular Ashkenazim and largely religious Sephardim and Edot HaMizrach, Jews from these countries. The leaders of the Jews from these countries that came in and were treated as second-class citizens, and I'm not going to get into the issue of how we defined racism, but they were certainly treated as second-class citizens, and there was a lot of paternalism and exploitation throughout the 1950s and 60s. Their leaders were rabbis. They did not go through the same Western secularization process that European Jews went through. So while under European Jews, we're talking about a very small percentage of Jews who had maintained the power of the rabbis for most of their social and political activities, the leaders of these communities were all rabbis. And as the discrimination and as the sense of being discriminated against grew, you begin to see in Israel the growth of parties that represent this population. And my son is about to tell me I'm supposed to be here, so I will just tell it I'm here. You had the parties. There were various smaller parties that began, but they acquired significant political power with the establishment of Shas. And it's very important to understand Shas, the phenomenon of Shas. If somebody doesn't know exactly what I'm talking about, hopefully it'll come through, but you can also ask me. The phenomenon of Shas, and particular Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, is extremely important in this. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef was the first non-Ashkenazi rabbi, first from the Sephardi community, to have national stature as a Talmid Chacham, as a very learned expert in halacha and Jewish law. Well, I don't want to get into who's better than whom. There's different groups will vote differently, but clearly he was the dominant figure. He was the only one. He was the first time that somebody from within the Zionist framework, within the Israeli framework, that he was widely accepted as being a power in this community, and he was what's called the spiritual head of the Shas party. And Shas grew and acquired wider and wider support in this community because it represented their aspirations, their resentments. Shas is headed by a council of Torah sages, just like the Ashkenazi and Haredi parties. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef is the one. He decides, and I don't want to make this too trivial, but on critical issues, he will decide. Certainly among the members of the Knesset, I believe that the fourth largest party in Israel. I don't remember if they got more than Israel Beitenu. Right? I think that the fourth largest party is Likud and Kadima, rather, first, then Likud, then Israel Beitenu, which is Lieberman's party, and then Shas. Shas has been and continues to be an essential element of a coalition. It is, unless the two big parties come together and agree on a platform and can govern and decide who gets to be prime minister and all those other things that Livni and Netanyahu couldn't agree on, Shas is the glue. You need Shas in the coalition. It's very hard, almost impossible to govern without Shas, not simply because of the numbers, but because of the population that they represent. You cannot exclude such a large and important population of Israeli society from the political process. And that's why issues like personal status, religion, conversion, army service, all of those things, all those important aspects of Israeli society are governed by rabbinical decisions. Because Shas plays a central role. Shas, in alliance with, in competition and in alliance with the other religious parties, particularly the Haredi parties, form a significant component of the political structure, and neither of them can be seen to be too lenient, because then they'll be accused of being too lenient, and that will hurt them in the next set of elections, because you run an election by who is more true to this basic set of values that is still very strong in these communities. Now that's an important part of the story. That means, for instance, we have a chief rabbinate. We have two chief rabbis. It's not like the British chief rabbis. I don't want to make any comparisons. It's more like the Archbishop of Canterbury, where I'm going to be in real trouble if I keep going with these analogies. But these are established religious frameworks. The chief rabbis and the rabbinical courts, the Batei Din, and the decisions they make are binding. They are appointed by the state. They are funded by the state. Not only do we have a chief Sephardi and Ashkenazi rabbi, but each town council has, or each regional area has a religious council and has its own appointed rabbi. There's a semi-attempt to get Jerusalemites to be involved in the choice of a rabbi, but it's a rigged system. It's largely, you're supposed to pick representatives, which then go to be other representatives, and eventually they're supposed to pick the rabbi of Jerusalem, but only certain segments are allowed to vote. And the distribution of votes are very random. Not random, they're very controlled. So there's a quasi-democracy, but this is it. The chief rabbi of Jerusalem is a plum job of Tel Aviv, of other towns. And so therefore, the religious establishments of the parties are not going to let this go. All of this is part of the process of the way in which religion has become empowered, not just the religion, I want to make it more strong. The Orthodox, also not an appropriate term, because it doesn't really apply to Shas and to people from the Jews who came from all these different countries outside of the Western world, where there is no alternative, there is no conservative reform, Eidot HaMizrach version. This is a Western concept. It's part of the Reformation, the emancipation of the last 200 years in the West. Napoleon didn't get that far out, so Jews did not go through that process there. Those are the realities. Now, to get to our issue, this was all introduction. To get to our issue, why is conversion so important? Determining the ground rules for conversion is really a matter of which rabbis, which rabbinical process has the authority and the power to make these decisions. It's a huge business. We're talking about potentially 300,000 or 400,000 Jews from the former Soviet Union. And the question of what the process is and who has control of it is very much seen as the reflection, the ultimate reflection of the power of the rabbis. If it's taken away from them, they see that their entire power structure is under threat, the slippery slope problem which affects every politician. I've got to hold on to this. This is my big source of power and influence. And the interpretation, and I don't want to be overly cynical and say that the power comes first and the debates about what the requirements are for conversion come second, but we certainly cannot ignore the issue of the political power here. And we're talking about a power struggle between groups. When the army said the conversion process and the fight between different religious courts over exactly what the process should be is too complicated. And we had the Knesset, the whole inquiry process, which led to the establishment of a system which would bring in Orthodox and Reform rabbis, but the ultimate decisions were in the hands of the chief rabbis. But then the chief rabbis don't recognize what being taught by the conservative and Reform rabbis, so we're not going to sign off on anybody's certificates in the army. These are kids who've lived in Israel, many of them all their lives. We're talking about large numbers, not handfuls anymore, large numbers. They serve in the army, they get killed in the army. I can't tell you, I'm sure you can understand, maybe you can't, but how embarrassing, awkward, terrible it is when you know that a soldier and someone that my daughters have been involved in training some of these soldiers, and we know some of the people, somebody is killed in action, and he can't be buried in the Jewish cemetery. He has to be buried outside the area of the Jewish part of the cemetery. And there are now cemeteries that are being created, and I don't remember where this stands, where non-Jews, it just doesn't make any sense. It's inhuman. Now that's widely understood. The question is, what do we do about it? How do you resolve this? And the army said, this is ridiculous. We have a chief rabbi in the army. We have a rabbi, we have a whole rabbinical corps in the army. We are just as empowered as anybody else as rabbis to establish a rabbinical court and to approve conversions. And we'll give all of these kids in the army a course. Nobody's coerced, but almost everybody wants to become Jewish. They want to be halachically Jewish. It's not the fact that their mothers weren't Jewish or can't prove that they were Jewish. Let's just get it over with. Let's join Israeli Jewish society and be part of that. Give us our rabbinical certificate. No, you can't do that. You have to promise that you will be observed. There are millions of secular Jews who don't observe Shabbat and Kashrut, but if you want to get converted, then you have to promise and you have to be shown to be observing Kashrut, and it's like having this little private police group that follows you around. The system doesn't work. And the army said, okay, in a quiet way, we are going to set up a process with the rabbis in this establishment process that was actually approved by the Knesset but not properly implemented, and we will then give these young soldiers a process and a hope and affirmation. Well, that was too much. That was a threat to the rabbinical establishment. Not only was that a threat to the rabbinical establishment, which said, no, we won't recognize this, and that's what blew up the fight the latest time and led to the attempt to create a new process and a new set of legislation. But we don't also, by the way, all the conversion that's gone on outside of Israel, we don't recognize that either. And they didn't say this, but I will say it. Why? Because it's a threat to our power. Because more, in the 60s, and there weren't many people, 60s, 70s, and not that it was that easy to travel. So how many conversions of Israelis took place where Israelis went to Chutz La'aretz, got converted, and came back? Probably not very many. But now everybody can do it. If the Israeli rabbinical process is too inflexible and stubborn and demanding and unreasonable, then you can go and find reasonable rabbis. I won't mention any names. I know some of them. They're reasonable rabbis. In the Orthodox movement, among others, and there are communities which have combined Batei Din. That even more threatened the power of the rabbinical establishment that I described earlier. That's why it all blew up, in my view. That's why the government, through the pressure of Shas and Eli Yishai and the Agudat Yisrael, the other coalition members, pressed for giving the chief rabbinate the ultimate authority, and again led to an outcry from Jewish communities around the world that said that they don't represent us. This is a Jewish issue, it's not only an Israeli issue. Now, from a political standpoint, and I will end in a couple of minutes, actually I'll make a couple of optimistic comments, then I'll open it up for discussion, but from a political standpoint, I hope that you understand my goal was to explain to you, not to justify, but to explain to you how completely complex this is. And how deeply rooted it is. We're not talking about something that came up overnight. We could certainly trace it back to 62 years or 100 years of this movement. It is very deeply rooted. It is very strongly felt as a threat to the power of the traditions. Who are you to tell us? So it is a very intense issue within the Israeli political system. And it's only secondarily that the government and Netanyahu and others, Bougie Herzog, some of the ministers, some of the Israeli politicians who have somewhat of an ear for the diaspora, began to hear the protests and say, wait a minute, we have to just go beyond just local coalition politics. And that was a welcome alliance. It was not that we want to stop the rabbis, but we realize that we have to deal with the outside community, and the pressure was felt. And Shas now, there are individual rabbis from Shas, I've never seen this before, who are saying we are beginning to look bad. We look pretty bad in this. We're going to lose support. That's politics. I understand that. Okay? We're going to lose support. If we continue to appear to be the bad guys, let's lighten up a little bit. Let's be more flexible. Let's be more humane. I don't use that term. They use lighten up and flexible maybe. Because it's not good for us. And actually, it's counterproductive to our goal of maintaining traditional Jewish values in our communities. So we have to understand that there are certain regulations that שהציבור לא יכול לעמוד בו, that the public cannot accept. And that message, I don't want to be overly optimistic, it's getting through in some cracks here and there. When you have a member of Shas who says that publicly and sees his political future as being able to be enhanced by this process. Again, I'm not being cynical. He may very well, in fact, see that in terms of a sincere personal beliefs and philosophy. And you have conflicts within Shas. There have been undertones of that personal conflicts between the previous leader, Aryeh Deri, and the current leader, Eli Yishai, and trying to get support from Avadia Yosef, who's getting quite old, and the court around him. And Avadia Yosef's son's boy, I could do this forever, but we're getting off into the very, very nitpicky details of all of this. That there is some potential for moving. Now, what I think has to be done carefully is to realize that if there's too much pressure to change, that the establishment will get even more defensive. You have to put on enough pressure consistently and a direction, and I want to mention that for a minute, direction towards that change, but at the same time to avoid making, to the extent possible, the power holders overly defensive, overly scared of losing everything. So I think that's what Netanyahu is trying to do, to maneuver this through. Now let me say a couple words about what I said earlier about Netanyahu and then talk a little bit about some of the other signs of optimism within the rabbinical establishment for just a couple, or the non-establishment, the alternative establishment for a couple of minutes. And I really will finish in a couple of minutes on this. As I said before, and I want to emphasize this, I think we missed a big chance. This is when I tell people, come to Israel, help us change things, get out and vote. I think we had the best chance possible for a coalition between the two big political blocks, the two big secular political blocks, not anti-religious, but they're secular, Likud and what's called Kadima now, and it's a sort of an centrist evolution. One of the important changes in Israeli politics is a movement towards the center, both on external issues of war and peace, but also on internal issues, including the role of the rabbinate and religion. Less ideological, more thick. Those are the issues that appealed to voters in the last two elections. It was Sharon saying, I'm not going to be bound in Likud by right-wing fanatics who won't let me withdraw from Gaza because I can go with people from the Labour Party who are not going to be bound by what became, I won't get into the left-right issues, but the center of Israel has grown, a pragmatic center. And there isn't that much difference between most Likud voters and most Kadima voters. And most of them are cynical anyway about the whole process and pick the lesser two or more evils. But together between Likud and Kadima, you almost had 60 votes. Almost had a majority. In the political, another, and for reasons we can guess at, and it certainly did come up, but it didn't happen. They could have gotten together, they could have changed the political process, then they could have held elections a year or two later and made the best man or woman win. But they decided not to do that. There were a couple of other efforts to change the Israeli electoral system to get it away from this multiple party system. For a few years we had a broken American system called, we used cast two votes for the prime minister and for a party, which basically meant that people voted for the prime minister. It was, I think, Barack once and Sharon once. And then they voted for the smallest parties they could find that represented the closest to their interest. So you even had more scattered, more diffuse politics, and that system didn't work. There was discussion of going to a regional representation. That would mean that most of the 120 members of the Knesset wouldn't get reelected. Well, that's a non-starter. You're not going to get elected. You're not going to vote for a change in the political system, which may be wonderful for the country, but for you personally, you lose your base. You can't function that way. So this is a better opportunity, and it just didn't happen. And I frankly blame the Israelis for that. They should have taken that step with some. I think also, from analysis of politics, they would have come out stronger for having been made a historical change. One more word about the rabbinical establishment, and that is, as I said, not only within Shas, also within the Israeli Zionist religious framework, there is more disquiet about the political power, and the political power that's used in a very cynical way. There's Rabbinate Sohar, there's a group of rabbis who are not part of the Orthodox rabbinate system. They themselves are Orthodox practice. But they have followings precisely because they are more, I don't want to say the word flexible, they are less inflexible. They are less politicized. They do not seek political power, and they criticize. And the Rabbinate Sohar is growing. In my view, I can be personal and make my personal comments too slowly. Like other groups, I think they are also worried about being criticized for being, to use in the rabbinical framework, too left-wing, to moving too much to be looking like maybe conservative reform, which are all considered to be over the red line from an Israeli religious perspective. But I think that's also changing. And you see younger rabbis that are developing very strong followings, Rav Shirlo, Rav Benny Lau, and others, who are not afraid to speak out on these issues, who are not afraid to challenge the establishment, who say very clearly that many of the decisions made by the rabbinical establishment are anti-Jewish values. They are relatively small, and the question is, how do they translate those views into changing policies without becoming themselves trapped in this political process? That's a very difficult challenge. I'm optimistic about this, though. I think that the issues are now being said publicly, straightforwardly. There will be some bad legislation which will begin to change the process. And then hopefully from the change, not just hopefully, but through what I see as the insistence that we continue to pursue these issues, because we cannot continue to have this very small group that carry the balance of power impose their, not just their views, but also their power on what is largely a consensus-based society. And therefore, something's going to have to give. And I see those voices coming out and saying, yes, we have to do that. There are other aspects I could point to for this process, but I do see this as evolving in a positive but slow way. And it's important to continue the pressure from the outside so that evolution continues. Okay, I think we still have time for some discussion and questions, right? So I'll stop here. It's hard for me to see you. And shout at me. I'm supposed to repeat the question so that our listeners out there in Webland will hear it. You're going to hit me again, right?
No. My question relates to the willingness of the modern Orthodox movements in Israel and outside of Israel to partner with the more liberal movements, the conservative and the reform, whatever you want to call them, movements, in order to address this and potentially other issues. I'm also curious if you've heard about the book that Rav Amsalem from Shas is about to come out with. It's only in Hebrew. He is not an English speaker. I've heard him speak. He's brilliant. How influential do you believe that will be in terms of helping to turn the tide within Shas?
Let me start with the second one. When I talked about the changes within Shas, where you have individuals within Shas who recognize that they are losing support and what their policies are no longer sustainable. I was referring to Rav Amsalem. I just didn't know that he was understood and heard here. Yes.
Yeah, just so people know, what he has written is a book that basically lays out from a rabbi.
Peacenik, which is, let's be careful.
Right. So he's he's a francophone
from North Africa.
Right. But he has focused on the history of the conversion issue. It's in halakha from the beginning of halakha, and he has demonstrated what a travesty the entire issue has become since Rob Sherman's ruling nullifying a conversion a couple of years ago, which then led to the nullification of Rabbi Druckmann's.
Which was all politics. I didn't get into all of this, but it was all politics of who is a rabbi. And look, Rav Amsalem is doing something that is largely unheard of, certainly breaking from Shas from within the inner circle. He is being pressed he may be pushed out of the Knesset.
He's been kicked out from Shas, hasn't he?
I don't think he's been kicked out from Shas yet. There have been calls to it. I don't think that they've reached that stage. And sorry?
He's just been kicked out of the minyan.
Out of a minyan that I believe, and there's probably a cherem on him. But he made the calculation, in my view, that in the long term, these are the issues. He's going to be riding the top of the wave. That he'll suffer a little bit. There's very few politicians who are willing to take that risk, and he's going through that process now. But if you subscribe to the view that all publicity is publicity, he's on the front page of the papers with his picture just about every day, and this book is widely anticipated. But I should say I haven't read the book. But the arguments that are made about the fact that this whole conversion is totally distorted for political purposes, I think that my debating partner from yesterday, Rabbi Riskin, I think he also talked about that here, I think, in one of the sessions. And certainly if you read, it struck me just looking at last week's Parsha about 2 weeks ago, Vayechi, I wondered whether the sons of Yosef, whose mother wasn't Jewish, whether they actually converted or not. And of course then inside of one of the Mefarshim, maybe Rashi, they say, well, in fact, this wasn't really that Yosef's wife, the daughter of Potiphar, was in fact really Dinah, or the daughter of Dinah. There's all sorts of tricks to say that they didn't have to come to Jewish. But the point is that this whole conversion thing really has gotten totally distorted from what it was historically, but for political purposes, and that's what the point I was trying to say. So if you need politics to fight politics. On the issue of the relationship between the Israeli modern Orthodox rabbis and the conservative and reform rabbinate here, I think there are problems, because there's also, I didn't talk about it, here meaning diaspora. But certainly there are rabbis who see this, conservative and particularly reform rabbis, who have made this into their political flag and sought escalation and gotten headlines and publicity. And in terms of resolving the problem, that's not particularly helpful. I think it's not that much of an issue for modern Orthodox rabbis who are, the emphasis is as much on the modern as the Orthodox, that those kind of internal wars are not particularly useful or required religiously. That there are plenty of very important, respected Orthodox rabbis in North America, probably in the UK and Australia, who sit on Batei Din with conservative and reform colleagues. And not here? Not here. Sorry, that's right. Not here. I realize that's an issue. That's an issue. In North America, I know about them, where there are community-wide Batei Din, and there are rules of the game for doing that. I better learn more about the politics of British Jewry, which I don't think I want to hear about it. Somebody else should be doing that. Limmud in Israel, telling us about the politics here. So, but it also depends on how much friction is put into that system, and if it's not made into an issue, it's easier to resolve. If it's seen as a threat, then it will be resisted.
How is it that Israel Netanyahu, the Lieberman party, which stood at the last elections against the rabbinate, has so allowed itself to be marginalized?
Well, first of all, they're the ones who are causing the trouble now. It's the Lieberman party, which is based on a strong but not only Russian constituency. Ran on that, partly on that platform, but they also ran on what one would call a right-wing political platform, which Lieberman represents as foreign minister. They're not in a hurry to get out of the government. Again, politics. Lieberman does not want to create a coalition crisis which gives the other coalition partners an excuse to push him out of the government and have somebody else as foreign minister. So he plays it carefully. But after 2 years, his constituency says, no, you told us you were going to make this an important issue. You're going to be another politician that's going to fail to implement his promises completely. So now the issue came up. He said, we've waited 2 years. Now we have to push it. And that's where the friction comes in. I think that what they're doing is carefully calculated. They're going to go as far as they think they can get support, but not to the point where they're going to be pushed, where they're going to be forced to say, we didn't get what we demanded, we're leaving the government. On security issues and negotiation issues, they're in an alliance with Shas. They agree with Shas. So they're going to be careful on how they play that.
Can you explain what the Rabbi Druckmann...
Sorry, I can't hear you?
Could you please explain again what the Rabbi Druckmann conversion issue was?
Yes, I'll try to explain it. I did try to avoid this. I don't remember how many years ago, but I believe it was 10 years ago. This is a rough number. Because of the question, first of all, I think it's still true, in our IDs that I don't have mine with me. The ideas, don't tell anybody, from Israel, you have to write religion. And there were a series of court cases, or one major court case, and where it had to do with someone who had gone abroad. Boy, I can spend 2 hours on this, so I better get to the point quickly. The issue of conversion and the role of courts to question how one is defined came about 10 years ago. And the courts basically said either we rule, and if we rule, we'll simply say that this is unacceptable interference of religion and rabbis and state principles, because those are beyond personal status. This is about what's written in your ID card and all sorts of other factors. Or you and the Knesset have to come up with a compromise that can be passed into law. And they formed the current Minister of Justice, Ne'eman, was called the Ne'eman Commission, and they had representatives from just about every sector that were there, including Rabbinate, including Orthodox, and I think also conservative. There were conservative, and I think Reform members on it too, from Israel, and they met for a long time, and they came up with an approved document that led to the establishment of these conversion education programs, which were based on a combined curricula. At the last, the chief rabbinate would not sign on to it. So the Knesset, this is my role in history. I got one of the Knesset members that I was in contact with, the Knesset, who was also in this committee, to publish documents that hadn't been signed as a Knesset document, so that at least it had some public visibility. And then it was adopted and implemented and funded. And the head of that was Rav Druckmann. He was the rabbinical authority for that process of conversion that went through the Prime Minister's office and included those soldiers who had gone through the conversion education program in the army were officially, their conversion documents were signed by Rav Druckmann, or were I don't know if they were signed, but if they were endorsed by Rav Druckmann, and that was the process. And the unwillingness for the reasons I explained earlier, to accept that by the chief rabbinate led to the explosion that we're seeing now. Well, if you don't like that system and you won't sign on, and you refuse to sign those certificates, you don't accept Rav Druckmann's conversion. If, in other words, if someone who was converted through that process goes to one of the other rabbis, chief rabbi of one of the towns that doesn't accept this and says, I want to get married. No, you can't get married. You're not Jewish. I don't recognize that conversion certificate. And not only that, but I don't recognize anybody's conversion certificate, including from North America, from Britain, or any other place. And that's what led to the current crisis. That's the match that blew up, was a smoldering process anyway. And this was because Rav Druckmann had assumed power, and they'd gone around this way, and they saw this process as a threat to their own power. If there's anybody up there, let me wave your hands like this, because I can't see that far in these lights.
I wonder if you could say a few words about how the respective dayanim from the national religious bloc have been effectively blocked out over recent years from the major button. So groups such as Tzahar have to work outside of the body, outside of the main apparatus of the chief rabbinate.
Well, you basically said it, and I think that. Sorry. The question was, can I explain more? Can I go into more how it is that the modern Orthodox Israeli, what was called Mafdal at one time, I don't know what they're called now, they keep changing their name, but why the rabbis from that stream, including kibbutz rabbis from places like Levi and Sad and other places, were pushed out of the rabbinical structure, and that also meant many of them are part of the Tzohar process, so they are external to, and that's more, I'll add one other fact to that. The modern Orthodox religious political framework has become weaker consistently for at least the last 30 years, losing more and more support in votes. Now, part of that was that back in the 50s and 60s, it was the only religious framework in town, essentially, and so you had the Shas voters would also vote for Mafdal, for the National Religious Party, which was dominated by Ashkenazi. So you lose that population already somewhere around the 80s. But in addition, the fact that the Mizrahi Party, what was called the National Religious Party, became fundamentally, I shouldn't use that term, came focused primarily on settlements and the construction of settlements and that agenda. And although there were some attempts to pull that back, Zvulun Hammer, late Zvulun Hammer and others tried to pull it back, by that time it was too late. So they also lost the ability to attract voters. If you were really a right-wing settler, then you had much better parties who really pushed that issue. And if you were concerned about religious issues, then this party wasn't really pushing them. They were secondary issues to that. So the number of seats that they got kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And various attempts to revive it have failed, and it's really more or less an empty shell. What you now have is a lot of people who are part of the modern Orthodox movement, and are modern Orthodox in terms of their families and in terms of their education and others, vote for secular parties. They vote Kadima, they vote Meretz. Some of them, they vote I think there's still 3 people who may vote Labor, I don't know. But across the structure, they vote right-wing parties, but they don't have enough of a common agenda to be able to support what was once the National Religious Party. And so the Rabbi and others don't have that political base. What they do is they perform weddings, and they're used as religious authorities when people want to avoid going to the rabbinical structure, to the chief rabbinate. I think this whole thing is very complicated. Have we just about exhausted this topic? Anybody else? Sorry. See, I was looking up there.
So, have you, I don't know if you know, but with all this business in the Israeli chief rabbinate, they don't want to recognize conversions from outside Israel. I mean, do you know what the Dayanim in London, the London Bet did think of it?
No, I would use this platform to do that. I've already gotten in trouble by guessing wrong about how the British Anglo-Jewish religious establishment functions. It's problematic enough to have a whole session on that, but I guess Limmud is not the place to do it. They don't come to Limmud, right? Yes?
One slightly different manifestation of issues relating to power. One different problem which relates to the power of the rabbis or in certain societies, the extent to which the low level of Haredi involvement in economic activity and the impact of that on the Israeli economy. And I just wondered to what extent is that also a major catalyst for change?
That's a whole other topic. The question was, to what degree is the absence of the Haredi population, which is growing and significant in the economic, not just the economic, but also the political, the military security life of Israel, having an impact? It's a huge problem, and it's one of those problems that also it's related and nobody knows how to solve. A large part, I don't know what the percentage is, but there's a very significant part of the budget that goes for support. In theory, or rather under the label of welfare support, the ultra-Orthodox population, the Haredi population, is very poor. Large families, no significant income from jobs, living in very crowded quarters, and therefore they are a real source of social welfare issues and poverty and other things, and they're not inclined to change. And so therefore, I'm not sure. And certainly the Israeli economy is thriving, and I don't know that one could really say that they're a real drain on the economy now. But certainly the budgetary transfers, the percentage of the government budget that continue to flow as welfare payments to that sector of the economy, when their critics say they don't do anything to try to solve these problems on their own, is an increasing problem. It's exactly the same sort of issue where there's general agreement from the center of the political process, left and right, Kadima and Likud and others, that this has to change, but they're not willing to get together, and therefore they're still able to, the Haredi parties are able to use that as a wedge issue. There's been various attempts there's also a huge amount of resentment. We all send our children to the army, and we all serve in the army, and there's a huge cost to that, and they don't. And it can't be that hundreds of thousands of these Haredi young men are all studying in yeshiva, and we all need them as rabbis. So there's that tension there, but how do we resolve it? And it's exactly the same process that I'm talking about. It is a pressure cooker. I will admit that I expected it to explode a number of years ago, and it hasn't done so yet. They are able to patch it together year after year after year as the costs continue to go up. I thought that when we had a major repression, no, that's not the right word, but whatever it is, back in the recession, that's it. I think I better get down from this podium. I have to do another talk still today. About, I'm trying to remember also how many years ago, around 2000, 2001, in that period, just at the beginning of the terrorism and the violence, it coincided with a lot of recession and unemployment, significant unemployment, and I thought it would blow up then. The government's budgets were cut very significantly, but it didn't. Netanyahu was the treasury minister under Sharon, and they patched it together. So it remains a pressure cooker. There were various laws that were passed. There was specifically one law that required or gave incentives to young men, Haredi men, to take a year off of the yeshiva and go into the army, and a number of them did that. And the idea was that after they were in the army, they would have just enough exposure to the secular world that they could then go into the economy. And the rabbis in the Haredi world were willing to accept that as a compromise, but were not willing to expand it. And it was very minimalist in the impact that it had. So let's see if we can find a way it looks now. But every year when the budget is passed in Israel, when the budget is discussed, it is a huge source of resentment. And I think that Rav Amsalem, that's also part of his agenda. We can't be seen to be the kind of burden, although he's really part of that grouping, but they vote together with to maintain the system with the question. Right? Yeah.
Do you think that the Islamic pressure on Israel, in particular, the move to delegitimize the state, will actually force the rabbinate into a reality check?
The question was whether the pressures on Israel campaigns, all the other things I talked about, will force the rabbis to really check. My answer is I very, very much doubt it. Most of the rabbinical authority, the power of the rabbis, do not look beyond Israel. They simply have no concept and no interest in what goes on beyond Israel. And if worse comes to worse, that's God's will, so God will either protect us or punish us. That's just a different vocabulary. With, again, a few marginal exceptions. So I'm not optimistic on that. But there are other reasons to be optimistic. I just want to end by saying something that's hard to say, and that is that understanding the complexity, I hope, or at least my explanation of the complexity, will allow people like you who are looking from the outside looking in and frustrated with the Israeli system to understand that this is not some sort of a willful decision to be a slap in the face to diaspora Jewry, to different parts of the Jewish people, but it's just deeply built into the political process, and it will take politics to take it out, and that's something that has to be done over time. Thank you all. Enjoyed the conversation.